Welcome to A Night for Truth, conversations on the writings of Dietrich von Hildebrand, the great 20th century philosopher and theologian in the Catholic Church. We have as our special guest Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, the wife of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and we have been speaking in this series most particularly of his book, Transformation in Christ, which, as will have been apparent to those of you who have been able to watch the other episodes, is a book which reaches into virtually every cranny and ventricle of our human experience. It's a book with tremendous insight, almost a frighteningly surgical exactness to do with the moral and the spiritual, the interior life. We're speaking at the moment, we have been speaking for at least one episode, I think, on the chapter entitled, Blessed are the Peacemakers. We're all familiar with the Beatitudes, and if you're anything like me, you may tend to let the Beatitudes roll off your back like water off a duck's back, thinking, oh, well, I know all about this. But there's a sense in which the Beatitudes represent a very key point in our Lord's ministry here on earth, and Dietrich von Hildebrand's scrutiny of this topic in this chapter, it happens to be the longest chapter in the book, is amazing. We often think of the peacemakers in diplomatic or political terms, and indeed, God bless all the peacemakers who have helped to avert wars and conflicts. But of course, this is something which also reaches deeply into one's own soul, and not only I myself, but my relationship with other people. Am I one who stirs up trouble, who is a source and a center of agitation, or, like St. Francis of Assisi, do I pray, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace? So, Lily, where shall we start today?
Let me repeat at the very end of the programs that we've done together something I said at the very beginning. Number one, that when you read a chapter like Blessed are the Peacemakers, I believe that each and every one of us can recognize that we have not contributed to peace, that we have created obstacles in ourselves preventing us from actually being instruments of God's peace. The second thing that I would like to say is that this peace can be achieved, but there's only one road, the supernatural and the response to grace. When you think of what politicians are trying to achieve, speaking about peace and peace and peace, and what they achieve on a purely natural level is usually just a postponement of another catastrophe, and very little can be done. Now, what I'm going to defend is a thesis that peace can be achieved, but it can only be achieved by the laborious way of the supernatural, which implies humility and collaboration with grace.
Let me ask a question right here, which I suspect may have arisen in viewers' minds just over your phraseology here, which touches very keenly on the whole Catholic view of grace. You say it can only be achieved by grace, and most people think of that as a free gift, but you also use the word laborious. How does the Church understand the relationship between the grace of God, which He bountifully gives to us, and your word laborious?
Because I must collaborate. God respects my free will, and unless I collaborate, and this always implies, and I'm going to quote once again the rule of Saint Benedict, to go back on the right path of obedience from which we have strayed by disobedience. And this is laborious. You know, my fallen nature, day after day, from morning to night, is always pulling me downward. There's a sort of spiritual law of gravity that pulls me downward. Maybe I strive for peace for a few moments, and then next moment I get irritated for some reason, and then instead of being an instrument of peace, I become an instrument of disharmony. No, I reread Transformation for these programs. I've read it innumerable times, and something has struck me. I don't think I've been struck by it before, because I'm not capable of absorbing the richness of the message all at once. But then it is in various chapters. My husband points to the danger of being offended. And he has a magnificent description of why being offended can separate us not only from other people, but actually from Christ. And once again, we go back to what we said previously. These seem to be small, insignificant little things. But these little threads are enough to nail me in my fallen nature and prevent me from ascending the mountain of the Lord. Now, let me start by just saying that sensitivity is a gift of God. You and I have to choose between having a bovine nature, thick skin, feeling absolutely nothing, or having a very sensitive nature, which is more likely to open to art, to beauty, to love, and so forth and so on. Well, of course, you would choose to be sensitive. I was told when I was a child by a nun who said, Christ has an exquisite, sublime sensitivity, which enabled him not only to love more and more deeply because he was God-man, but also to suffer more deeply. Now the question is, suppose that you or I happen to be very sensitive people, which in and by itself is a gift of God. Now we know full well, and of course at my age I learn it more and more, that every gift of God can be abused. You know, suppose that you take someone who is absolutely brilliant, has extraordinary intellectual talents. What can happen? Arrogance, haughtiness, self-assurance, knowing better than anyone else, a sort of inner readiness to teach the church what she should be teaching. You know, it's a temptation, because you're so brilliant, because your mind is so clear, because you have so many insights. Or you take someone who is extraordinarily beautiful or handsome and become narcissistic, whose whole satisfaction is to look in the mirror and to say, goodness, am I beautiful? Her little niece at the age of 3, she stood in front of a mirror and she turned to my mother, her grandmother, and says, Grandma, am I not pretty?
I've never had a lot of trouble with that temptation for some strange reason.
Well, you know, I haven't either. For this reason, I keep away from mirrors. But suppose that you do know, everybody is telling you how pretty you are, then you become narcissistic, and, you know, this sort of being pleased about oneself, and you enter a room, you expect everybody to fall on their knees and just say how beautiful you are. That is a danger of it. Now, I say sensitivity is a very fine, beautiful instrument. But unfortunately, because of our fallen nature, for many, many people, it turns into a real spiritual danger. So therefore we're going to say sensitivity is something beautiful, and you know that actually is given to me for greater compassion, greater mercifulness, greater interest in others, greater capacity to feel myself into them and to say the proper word at the proper time. If I misuse it, it degenerates into what I'm going to call touchiness. And touchiness simply implies that people are always on the alert for possible offenses.
And isn't that precisely a case in point of what evil always does?
Correct.
That is to say, evil can't come up with anything new. It's a parasite. All it can do is to twist or turn over or wreck something which is originally good, so that sensitivity is a good gift. All evil can do is it can't come up with a different virtue. All it can do is to twist that and turn it into touchiness.
Absolutely correct. Now, don't forget that my husband's work is a great defense of the beauty of feelings that have been very much looked on, let us say, by Aristotle, and there's also a certain tendency in Thomistic philosophy to consider feelings to be something dangerous, something that we have to beware of, something that we have to keep under control. Now, of course, inspired by Corinthians 1:13, my husband sings the praise of love as being the greatest thing, which of course implies not only my intellect and my will, but my heart. It is said in the Old Testament, give me your heart. You know, in other words, this is something that is going to illumine and has done magnificently in his book, The Heart, unfortunately a book which is out of print, and I'd love to see it back in print because I think it could be very helpful to many people. Now, the amazing thing is that this person who is so conscious of the greatness of feelings is also conscious of the dangers of feelings. Because the very moment that these feelings, instead of being responses to values, become a sort of self-centered interest in this very moment, it can be disastrous. You know, if I had a literary talent, it seems to me that I would be tremendously tempted to write comedies, because human beings are or can be extremely silly. And of course this includes myself, you know, otherwise you're always tempted to say the silly people out there. But I mean, everybody at times can be silly, and if God gives you the grace of a sense of humor, then you can laugh about yourself and say, my goodness, I truly made a fool of myself. Now, I know people who get offended for no reason at all. You know, for example, I knew a lady, my goodness, she was very lonesome, and she had a very difficult and unhappy life. But she spent her time being offended. You know, for example, because she found out that someone living in the same building had died, and her next door neighbor got the news before she did. And then somehow, you know, she was all ruffled and unhappy about it. You know, I can give you very many such examples, but I simply say some people seem to be on the alert, how can I be offended? Or someone doesn't greet you. You greet them and they don't respond. Or you leave a message on the telephone and you say, please call me back, it's urgent, and they don't. Or you send someone a birthday card and they don't send you one, and you can go on and on and on and on, and you're offended. You know, this is, of course, is silly. But
and it can
well, it can paralyze you.
It paralyze, and the word I was thinking of too is poison. It can poison one's whole being, so that over some almost a non-incident, you know, somebody didn't answer the phone call,
can explode up to something which is dramatic.
And I can be just seething with resentment and
bitterness
offense,
and so on and so on.
And then I try all sorts of strategies to strike back. You know, in novels, 19th century novels, women were always cutting each other. You know, lady so and so cut me the other night at a party, meaning, you know, I would come up and say hello, and she would go past as though I didn't exist. You know, you cut somebody, and we have our own ways of doing that.
Oh, you know, you get a new dress and no one pays you a compliment.
Yes.
And then you're offended. And you say, you know, another one got a compliment and I deserve it a lot more because my dress is nice and so. I mean, in other words, what we do when you don't have real problems, we create artificial problems, but not let us touch to something which is much, much more important. People are offended because of a criticism. Now, all of us, and this is a blessing, are criticized from time to time. You know, it is said in the rule of Saint Benedict, a sign of a Benedictine vocation, Tom, you're sitting down, is that people have a love for humiliations. And that is in the rule of St. Benedict, which I've read good many times in my life, and every single time I say, well, I'm afraid I'm an oblate, but an oblate is something not so serious.
So that's not something that comes very easily.
How is it that St. Benedict drew any vocation at all? You know, because, I mean, to be humiliated has the taste of death. This is the one thing that I claim, that we fear it more than we fear pains. It's just a horrible feeling. It's like a cold shower and so on and so on. Now, I recall that one day someone came to my husband and said to him, so-and-so has offended me very badly. And he said, what did he say? And then it was a criticism. And then he was silent for a moment, and he said, is it true? That was the one question the person hadn't raised. Is it a true criticism? Well, yes, but it didn't say so in a nice tone. Then you find another way of saying, you know, that you've been offended. Now, one thing is certain. If I'm accused of something that I haven't done, for example, someone accuses me of having stolen something, which isn't true, St. Francis of Sales says you must defend yourself in the name of truth. If, on the contrary, the person criticizes you because you are proud, or because vanity, or ambition, or self-centeredness, or whatever it might be, it is very wise to say to yourself, it is true in any case. You know, you cannot go wrong when you say to someone you are proud. And suppose that the person were to say, oh, you're totally mistaken, I made the humility.
It is a dash of salvific cold water, it seems to me, when, having been criticized and your feathers are ruffled and so on, and it suddenly comes to you, well, it was true what they said about me.
You see, but this implies humility. And this implies that you leave the natural level, because I claim that every criticism, however lovingly formulated, is bitter.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing that a fallen nature hates more, and I mean, this is why the temptation is always to put the fault on someone else. Starting with Eve, who puts the fault on the serpent, and then Adam put the fault on Eve. You know, it's not my fault.
It's interesting. You know, none of us has any trouble, none of us Catholics has any trouble in a sort of a general way, and in the liturgy and others saying, you know, I'm a sinner, I'm guilty, I'm unworthy, and so on. You know, that's all very well as long as it's sort of doctrinal or liturgical out here. But when it comes home to roost, when someone actually points out something, then all of a sudden I'm defensive. Oh, well, I'm not that bad. You know?
No, but I go further than that. I simply say that I don't find it very difficult to proclaim that I'm a sinner. But if you tell me that I'm one, then it truly
then I bristle.
Then I become awfully bitter.
Yeah.
No, you see, the question is precisely, what is the supernatural response?
Yeah.
Now, suppose that someone accuses me of being ambitious, of having vanity, of being self-centered, of being half-hearted, of being so on and so on. The only thing that I can say is, you're right. And even though you might say so out of rage, you might say so in a moment of bitterness, you might say so and your tone is harsh. One says in French, le ton fait la chanson. Meaning to say, you know, depending on your tone and so on and so on. And people always assume that they're entitled to be treated with kid gloves. You know, and forgetting that our Lord and Savior was certainly not treated with kid gloves. He was insulted. He was spat upon. He was beaten. He was condemned as a criminal. And I, the servant, am supposed to be very, very sweetly and lovingly pleased. You know, I hate to criticize. I know that you're fantastic. I know that you're absolutely remarkable. You know, maybe there's a black little dot there. And then you feel that you're heroic in accepting it, you see.
Now, how would your husband distinguish between the authentic humility and the readiness for humiliation of which St. Benedict speaks, between that and a kind of a crawling sycophantism or obsequiousness?
That is a caricature on a natural level.
Yeah.
You see, because don't forget, very much as the devil apes God, our fallen nature at times is very good at trying to ape the supernatural. And I mean, and some, let us say, atheists sometimes feel it. and feel that if you're religious and, you know, truly humble, they immediately will accuse you of being obsequious, of being a sycophant, of licking people's shoes, of having no dignity.
Yeah.
You see, but I mean, they forget that humility is a response of myself to God, which is infinitely perfect.
It's a truth.
The truth.
The truth
you know,
about
this is why it is said humility is truth. But I mean, as I said, it's very important to make a distinction between deeds, because if someone accuses me of having murdered and I haven't murdered, I have to defend myself in the name of truth. But when it comes to attitude, you can never go wrong. You know, once, many years ago, I experienced something that was interesting. There was a man, and he disliked a priest very much. You know, the priest was not always as perfect as he should have been, and he had something at times a little bit haughty and so on. And somehow they had a violent discussion.
I thought priests were perfect.
I thought so when I was 5 years old, and now I pray for them, because I realize that it's not an easy.
They're better than I am.
It's not an easy calling, you know, and they certainly have their trials and difficulties and need prayers, as everyone of us. Now, at any rate, he got mad and suddenly shot at the priest and said, "You're so unbearably proud." And the other one answered, "There, I must agree with you." What can you say?
That's a surprising line.
What can you say? You see, I mean, in other words, by acknowledging that he was proud, he had stepped the first little step of humility.
And it seems to me that, you know, I just thought of this as you were saying this, and I'm not sure that it had struck me before. In the sacrament of auricular confession, what is now called the sacrament of reconciliation, I guess, but confession.
It's milder.
Yeah, much milder. But we step into the precincts of truth, of the lucid, pellucid truth of heaven there, because the priest hears everything I've done, everything I have to say to myself, about myself, and so on and so on. I have never heard a priest say to me, "Well, you are a mess. Get out of here." I have never heard such tales in my life. You know, get out of my confessional, and so on. What we hear from the church is what we hear from God. And the priest shouldn't say, now some do nowadays, but shouldn't say, "Oh, that's nothing. That's okay. You're much better than you think you are."
And this is what they're doing today, and I think that it's a disaster.
But it's just but faithfully executed and enacted, the sacrament really brings us into the wonderful precincts of truth, where indeed, I am guilty of this, but the divine mercy doesn't deny that. It doesn't paper it over or scotch tape it over. It acknowledges that indeed that is so, but I am forgiven.
But you know, there's another thing. There are two more things that I would like to add in this context, because it's an extremely rich topic. And one of them is that very many people, as soon as you read the slightest criticism, it can be about their performance, it can be about their work, it can be about a particular thing that they have done, immediately they feel unloved. So, of course, all of us have a perfectly natural longing to be loved, because we are made for love. And, you know, I know children, I know a little boy who is crippled, and he receives so much love from his adopted parents that he's a radiant child. And I know kids that have everything in the world and are dreadful and happy because they get no love. You know, that's what we want. But surprisingly enough, as soon as someone criticizes me, I immediately feel such and such has something against me, or such and such doesn't love me.
Or they're not being fair.
Well, of course, immediately you feel rejected. And the question is, as I said, number one, is it true or not? And then number two, that if it is true, the person criticizing me is actually my benefactor. You know, this admirable, unbelievable line in Plato, when Socrates is, since most in dialogue, he's the main character. And I believe it is in Gorgias. I'm pretty sure it is in Gorgias. And then Socrates says to Callicles, "If you can prove me to be wrong, I'll call you the greatest of my benefactors." This is said by a pagan.
Yes.
You know, understanding if you liberate me from error, You're the greatest my benefactor. And if you liberate me from my illusions about myself, you are not my enemy, you are my friend. But nevertheless, if a doctor cuts off my thumb because there's gangrene in it, it's going to hurt. And you know, he's doing it to save my life, but it's not pleasant. And I repeat, to the very end of our life, any criticism on the natural level is going to be bitter and difficult, and it's only if you ascend on the other level of grace, in which you say yes to grace, and you realize that it is a call, something that God permits to bring you closer to Himself, and then it changes into joy. No, this means...
It's hard to do.
Well, dear one, why do you say hard to do? I say impossible without God's grace. You know, this is the very essence of Catholicism.
Yes.
What is required of us is impossible. Doesn't make any sense at all. Be perfect as your Father in heaven has.
Now, on that daunting note, we have to bring this part of the discussion to a close, but that's a good teaser to invite our viewers to join us as we continue this conversation on this very piercing question of what inner peace is and that which threatens it. Thank you for being with us for this episode on the writings of Dietrich von Hildebrand, A Night for Truth.